The Black Ledger, Episode 3, The Glass Protocol. The applause echoed through the underground station slowly, measured, deliberate, not celebration, recognition. Adrian stood motionless beside the operations panel, listening. One person applauding alone is unsettling. Several people applauding together in complete silence is far worse. The blast doors continued unlocking one by one, heavy steel bolts retracting deep inside concrete walls. Thomas Reed backed away instinctively. "They're here." No one answered him, because everyone already knew the footsteps beyond the doors remained perfectly synchronized. Disciplined movement, organized, military almost. Not Broker alone anymore. Broker's network. The final blast door slid open, and for the first time, Adrian saw them. Men and women dressed in dark, formal clothing stepped slowly into the underground station, not armed visibly, no masks, no panic, ages ranging from 30 to 70. Bankers, transit officials, police administrators, government staff, ordinary faces. That was the most disturbing part. Broker's organization did not look like criminals, it looked like civilization itself. At the center of the group stood Broker, older than the photographs, grey beginning at the edges of his dark hair, black gloves still covering his hands, calm eyes, controlled posture, and no visible fear whatsoever. Thomas whispered, "Oh God." Broker stopped 10 feet from Adrian. The underground alarms continued echoing behind them. Neither man spoke immediately, because intelligent men understand silence has structure too. Finally, Broker looked toward the preserved classroom behind the glass. "You found the archive." Adrian lit another cigarette slowly. "You wanted us to." Broker nodded once. "Yes." Harris stepped forward angrily. "You murdered people to stage all this?" Broker looked at him calmly. "No, Lieutenant." A pause. "I executed witnesses." Cold silence followed. Thomas stared at him in disbelief. "You think that makes it better?" Broker's expression never changed. "I think accuracy matters." Adrian watched him carefully. The breathing, the eye movement, the posture, no instability, no visible narcissism. Worse, conviction. Broker genuinely believed himself necessary. That made him infinitely more dangerous than ordinary killers. The underground station trembled softly again. Emergency broadcasts crackled through overhead speakers. Surface riots reported near Midtown access corridors. Thomas looked terrified. "You started a war up there." Broker finally looked toward the operations monitors. "No." A pause. "I removed certainty." Huge difference. Civilization survives through assumption. People believe trains will arrive, police will respond, systems will function. Broker wasn't destroying systems, he was exposing how fragile they already were. Adrian exhaled smoke slowly. "You built an entire philosophy around abandonment." Broker looked back at him. "No." Another pause. "I built it around selection." The word echoed heavily through the underground station. Selection. The hidden principle beneath every emergency system, every evacuation, every government contingency plan. Who survives first? Who waits? Who gets locked below? Behind Broker, the members of his network remained silent, watching Adrian carefully. Not cultists, participants, believers. That mattered enormously. Harris noticed it too. "These people actually follow you." Broker almost smiled. "They follow evidence." Thomas shook his head angrily. "You manipulated them." "No." Broker's voice remained calm. "I showed them how the city already works." The underground monitors shifted suddenly. Live footage from Manhattan flooded the screens. Crowds pushing against subway barricades, police redirecting civilians away from protected access corridors, government vehicles moving beneath Midtown secretly, and worst of all, people beginning to notice, fear spreading faster now. Broker stepped toward the screens slowly. In every crisis, his gloved hand moved toward the glowing map of Manhattan. Systems reveal their true loyalties. Green sectors remained protected, red sectors increasingly isolated, exactly like the Cold War plans, exactly like 1958. Adrian finally asked the question that truly mattered. What happens when the city fully panics? Silence filled the underground station, then Broker answered honestly, that depends. On what? Broker looked directly into Adrian's eyes. On whether people learn, a pause, or obey. Interesting, very interesting, because now Adrian finally understood something crucial. Broker did not want chaos permanently. He wanted transformation. He genuinely believed civilization could evolve through controlled collapse, which meant he saw himself not as destroyer, but architect. That made him even more dangerous. Harris suddenly raised his revolver. This ends now. Instantly. Every member of Broker's network looked toward him simultaneously. Not panic, calculation. Broker himself barely reacted. "You won't shoot me, Lieutenant." Harris tightened his grip. "Try me." Broker glanced toward the classroom behind the glass. "Because if I die now..." The monitors above them flashed red suddenly. The evacuation sequence continues automatically. Silence. Harris slowly lowered the gun. Broker nodded slightly. Exactly. The network behind him remained perfectly still again, disciplined, prepared. Adrian stepped forward. "You built a dead man's switch." "No." Broker's eyes darkened slightly. "I built inevitability." Again with the word, again with the philosophy. Everything in Broker's mind reduced humanity to systems and outcomes. Then Adrian noticed something important. One woman standing behind Broker looked nervous, not loyal, afraid. Interesting crack in the structure. Broker noticed Adrian observing her immediately. Small reaction, very small, but enough. Weakness. Adrian spoke quietly. "You're losing control." Several members of the network shifted uncomfortably. Broker remained calm. "No. You had perfect timing until tonight." Adrian stepped closer. "Now the city's reacting unpredictably." Silence. Another tiny pause before Broker answered. Tiny pauses reveal pressure. Unpredictability is transitional. "No." Adrian's voice sharpened slightly. "It's human." The underground station fell completely silent. Even the alarms above seemed distant now, because Broker finally understood Adrian's attack. Not physical, philosophical. Broker believed systems eventually overpower individuality. Adrian believed individuals eventually destabilize systems. That was the true conflict between them. Then suddenly, one of the underground monitors went black. Another, then another. Broker turned sharply toward the screens. First, real surprise all night. Interesting, very interesting. An operator inside the network rushed toward the controls. "We're losing Midtown surveillance." "How?" Broker asked calmly, but Adrian heard it immediately. The calm had changed. Smaller, tighter, pressure. The operator looked nervous. "Police rerouted civilian traffic into the financial tunnels." Silence. Thomas frowned. "What does that mean?" Adrian answered quietly before Broker could. "It means the city broke its own protocol." Exactly. The green priority sectors were now flooded with civilians unexpectedly. The protected evacuation routes had collapsed. Not because of Broker, because frightened officials made imperfect decisions under pressure. Human unpredictability. The one variable Broker believed could eventually be organized. Broker stared at the failing screen silently. Then Adrian said softly, "There it is." Broker looked toward him slowly. The floor. Another underground tremor shook the station, but now, for the first time, Broker looked uncertain. The underground station trembled again, harder this time. Dust rained from the ceiling above Citadel's lower archive. One of the emergency monitors exploded in a shower of sparks. Nobody moved, because everyone was watching Broker now. For the first time since Adrian had entered the underground network, Broker looked unsettled. Small change, tiny but real, and intelligent men notice tiny things first. Adrian stepped slowly toward the operations table. The city adapted. Broker's eyes remained fixed on the failing screens. Temporary instability. No. Adrian lit another cigarette calmly. Human behavior. The members of Broker's network exchanged uncertain glances. Not panic yet, but doubt. And doubt spreads through organizations faster than fear, especially when the leader appears less certain than before. One of the operators spoke nervously. Emergency barricades failed near Wall Street access corridors. Broker answered immediately. Reinforce secondary containment routes. Another hesitation from the operator. We can't. Silence. Adrian noticed it instantly. Not the words, the tone. The operator was no longer asking permission. He was reporting failure. Huge difference. Broker finally turned toward the giant Manhattan map again. Several green priority sectors had gone completely white now. Civilian overflow, mixed movement, no hierarchy remaining. The evacuation model was collapsing. Thomas stared at the screens in confusion. I thought that's what he wanted. No, Adrian said quietly. He wanted proof. Broker looked toward him sharply. Not anger, recognition, correct answer. Adrian continued. You built this entire operation to demonstrate that systems prioritize power over people. The giant map flickered violently. But if panic destroys the hierarchy itself, a pause. Then your thesis fails. Silence consumed the underground station. The network members behind Broker remained motionless, watching him, waiting. And for the first time, some of them looked uncertain too. Broker walked slowly toward the preserved classroom behind glass. His reflection moved across old desks and forgotten toys. You still misunderstand? Adrian followed carefully. No. A pause. I think you're afraid the city might survive imperfectly. Broker stopped walking. That mattered, because Adrian finally reached the core wound beneath the philosophy. Broker needed systems to behave predictably, otherwise his entire worldview collapsed. You think chaos reveals truth, Adrian said quietly, but chaos also creates accidents. The old underground lights flickered softly around them. People help strangers, a pause. Police break protocol. Civilians refuse instructions. Adrian's eyes never left Broker now. Human beings become irrational under pressure. Broker answered coldly. That is exactly why civilizations fail. No. Adrian stepped closer. That's why they survive longer than mathematics predicts. The silence afterward felt enormous. The members of Broker's network listened carefully now, not to Broker, to Adrian. Dangerous shift. Broker understood it instantly too. His posture changed slightly, more rigid, controlled. pressure again. Then one of the emergency radios crackled loudly behind them, a transit officer shouting over static, civilians breached lower evacuation corridors, another voice screaming in the background, repeat, financial sectors no longer secured. Static consumed the signal. Thomas whispered, the city's collapsing. No, Adrian said quietly. The city's improvising. Huge difference. Broker moved suddenly toward the central controls, fast, precise. His network members immediately followed orders without speaking. Emergency route maps shifted rapidly. Barricades redirected, transit lines sealed. Broker was trying to restore structure before panic evolved unpredictably. And Adrian finally understood the terrifying truth. Broker did not worship chaos. He feared uncontrolled chaos. He needed catastrophe organized, controlled, meaningful. Otherwise, all the deaths meant nothing. Adrian watched him work carefully. Interesting, very interesting, because Broker's greatest weakness had finally revealed itself. He believed systems could eventually eliminate uncertainty, but uncertainty was the one force no civilization ever fully controlled. Not governments, not armies, not mathematics, not even fear. Then suddenly, a young woman from Broker's network stepped away from the operations desk, the same nervous woman Adrian had noticed earlier, dark hair, grey coat, hands shaking slightly. Broker saw her movement immediately. Rachel. The entire room went still. The woman looked toward the emergency screens, crowds helping injured civilians near blocked subway routes, police officers abandoning protected corridors to assist trapped passengers. Not perfect behavior, human behavior. Rachel whispered softly, you said they would protect themselves first. Broker's expression hardened instantly. They are. No. Her eyes filled with uncertainty now. They're breaking protocol to help people. Silence, deadly silence, because ideology survives failure, but it struggles against contradiction. Broker stepped toward her carefully. Fear creates temporary irrationality. Adrian interrupted quietly. Or temporary humanity. Broker turned toward him sharply. That one sentence struck deeper than anger ever could. Rachel looked between them, confused, fracturing internally. Adrian continued softly. You built this entire movement on the belief that people will inevitably abandon each other under pressure. The giant Manhattan map flickered again, emergency sectors collapsing into uncontrolled movement. But tonight, the city stopped obeying its own survival hierarchy. The network members exchanged more uncertain looks, small fractures becoming visible everywhere now. Broker noticed it too, and suddenly, for the first time, his calm cracked. Only slightly, but enough. You think isolated acts of emotion change structure? His voice sharpened colder now. Civilizations are not built on kindness. No, Adrian replied. They're repaired by it. Silence exploded across the underground station. Rachel stepped backward slowly. Others behind Broker shifted uncomfortably too, because Adrian had introduced something catastrophic into the system. Doubt. Not about the city, about Broker himself. Then the underground alarm suddenly changed tone, lower, heavier. Broker turned instantly toward the operations screen, and this time, even Adrian's expression darkened. One section of Manhattan now flashed solid black. Lower Midtown, complete infrastructure failure. Transit dead. Power unstable, communications collapsing, not panic anymore, real danger. The operator looked horrified. We lost containment entirely. Broker stared at the screen silently, then whispered something Adrian barely heard. No. Interesting, very interesting, because that was not the reaction of a man achieving his plan. That was the reaction of a man watching his plan escape him. The giant map continued darkening sector by sector. The system was no longer selecting priorities. It was failing universally. Exactly the kind of uncontrolled collapse Broker feared most. Thomas looked toward Adrian. What happens now? Adrian stared at Broker, watching the certainty disappear slowly from his eyes. Then he answered quietly, now, a pause. The city becomes real. At that exact moment, every light inside Citadel went out. Total darkness swallowed the underground station, and somewhere far above them, Manhattan lost power. Darkness consumed Manhattan, not gradually, instantly. 1 second the city glowed above them. The next, nothing. The underground station fell silent, no alarms, no monitors, no flashing emergency maps, only darkness breathing through concrete corridors beneath the city. Then came the sound far above them, thousands of people reacting simultaneously, car horns, distant screams, the sudden mechanical death of an entire civilization losing power. Thomas Reed whispered into the blackness, "Oh God." Adrian remained perfectly still, listening. That was when he noticed the most terrifying detail. Broker sounded afraid, not loudly, not emotionally, but somewhere in the darkness, his breathing had changed. Slightly faster, slightly uneven, tiny changes, tiny truths. Emergency backup lights finally activated weakly across Citadel. Dim amber illumination flickered over frightened faces. Members of Broker's network stood frozen beside dead control panels. The giant map of Manhattan remained completely black. No systems, no data, no hierarchy, no control. Exactly the kind of collapse Broker never intended. The operator at the communications desk spoke shakily. "We lost the grid." Broker moved toward the controls immediately. "Backup generators. They're not responding. Restore transit surveillance. We can't." Every answer made the underground city feel smaller, more human. Broker stared at the dead monitors silently. Then Adrian spoke quietly behind him. "You built your philosophy around controlled fear." Broker did not turn around. "But fear isn't controllable." No response. Adrian continued. "That's the problem with systems." A pause. "They eventually stop obeying the people who designed them." The backup lights flickered again, outside the underground observation windows. Citadel suddenly looked ancient, not powerful, fragile, like a buried machine finally remembering its age. Rachel stepped away from Broker completely now. Several others followed subtly. Not rebellion yet, distance, but distance becomes dangerous inside ideological structures. Broker noticed every movement, of course he did. Men obsessed with systems always notice deviation first. Harris moved beside Adrian carefully. "You think this was him?" "No." Adrian watched Broker closely. "I think he pushed the city too far." Huge difference. A man causing destruction remains dangerous. A man losing control of destruction becomes catastrophic. Then, the underground radios exploded with static all at once. Voices flooded the room chaotically. Police frequencies, emergency responders, transit authorities, screaming civilians. Entire systems collapsing into confusion simultaneously. Subway fire near Lexington. Crowds forcing tunnel access. Financial district blackout spreading. We lost contact with Midtown Command. The city above was no longer following any one structure. Not Broker's, not the government's, pure human improvisation now. Broker finally turned toward Adrian slowly, and for the first time, there was no performance left in his eyes, only calculation, rapid, desperate. "You don't understand what happens next." Adrian stepped closer. "No." A pause. "I think you don't." Silence. The underground network members watched both men carefully now, waiting, choosing. That was the terrifying thing about collapsing systems. Eventually, every individual must decide who to follow independently. And independent decisions are impossible to predict perfectly. Broker walked toward the giant black Manhattan map. "You think this proves your point?" Adrian lit another cigarette calmly. "I think it proves civilization survives through adaptation." Broker's voice sharpened. "Civilization survives through structure." "Then why is your structure failing?" That hit hard. Very hard. Because deep down, Broker already knew the answer. The city was not behaving mathematically anymore. People were helping strangers instead of preserving hierarchy. Police were abandoning protected zones. Transit workers were reopening civilian tunnels manually. Humans improvising irrationally. Exactly the force Broker believed civilization eventually eliminates. Rachel spoke quietly from the shadows. He was right. Every head turned toward her instantly. Broker's expression darkened. Rachel stepped further away from the network group. "We thought people would become animals." Her voice trembled slightly. "But they're not." One of the operators removed his headset slowly. Another lowered his weapon. Small fractures, growing fractures. Broker stared at them silently, then finally spoke. "You're reacting emotionally." Adrian answered before anyone else could. "No." A pause. "They're reacting humanly." The underground city trembled violently again, this time harder than before. Concrete cracked somewhere deep below Citadel. Dust exploded from ceiling beams. Then the impossible happened. The sealed blast doors at the far end of the underground station opened automatically, slowly, without command. Cold air rushed inward from tunnels deeper beneath Manhattan. Broker turned sharply. Real fear now. Not philosophical. Practical. Interesting. Very interesting. Adrian noticed immediately. "You didn't open those." Broker said nothing. The darkness beyond the blast doors looked endless, ancient, and from somewhere deep inside it came another sound. Children laughing, soft, distant. Thomas went pale instantly. "No." Harris stared into the tunnel. "What the hell is that?" Broker moved toward the doors, quickly now, urgency replacing composure. Sealed the lower corridors immediately. The operators hesitated, not obeying instantly anymore. Catastrophic change. Broker shouted this time, "Now!" But before anyone could move, the underground lights flickered violently again, and all across the dark tunnels beyond the blast doors, old emergency lamps slowly began turning on one by one, revealing something horrifying. Rows of underground shelters stretching endlessly beneath Manhattan, entire hidden districts beneath the city, and standing silently inside the illuminated corridors, people, dozens of them thin, pale, motionless, watching Citadel from the darkness. Thomas whispered in horror, "Who are they?" Adrian stared into the underground abyss silently, then finally understood the final lie hidden beneath the city. The people trapped below in 1958 had never all died, and Broker had never been the only survivor. No one moved. The underground corridors beyond Citadel remained silent. Rows of pale figures stood motionless beneath flickering emergency lamps. watching, not attacking, not speaking, just watching the city that had forgotten them. Thomas Reed slowly stepped backward. His voice barely worked. "That's impossible." Adrian stared into the lower tunnels carefully. No sudden movement, no aggression. Interesting, very interesting, because panic usually creates movement first. Stillness meant something else entirely. Observation. Broker moved toward the blast doors slowly, and for the first time since Adrian met him, Broker looked genuinely shaken, not by the blackout, not by the failing systems, by them, the survivors. One of the pale figures stepped slightly forward into the light. An elderly woman, thin grey hair, hospital blanket wrapped around her shoulders, eyes sharp despite age, and around her neck hung an old subway identification tag, dated 1958. Harris whispered, "No." The woman looked directly at Broker, not with fear. Recognition, painful recognition. Then she spoke quietly. "Elias." Silence crushed the underground station. Thomas looked toward Broker instantly. "Elias." Broker closed his eyes briefly. Tiny reaction, human reaction. Adrian noticed it immediately. Names destabilize mythology. Broker was powerful as symbol, less powerful as man. The elderly woman stepped closer slowly. "You said you would never open the tunnels again." Broker's voice returned, softer now. "Different. Not performance, memory. I had no choice." "You always say that." The words hit harder than accusations, because familiarity destroys ideology faster than opposition ever can. The members of Broker's network watched silently, confused now, uncertain. The woman looked toward Adrian carefully. "You're not one of them." "No," Adrian answered quietly. "Neither is he." That made Broker finally look at him sharply. Adrian stepped closer toward the blast doors, toward the forgotten survivors. "They're not your army." Broker said nothing, because Adrian was right. These people were not followers, not revolutionaries, not believers. They were evidence, living evidence. And evidence behaves unpredictably. The elderly woman studied the underground station around her, the emergency monitors, the hidden government systems. Then she looked back toward Broker. They kept it all running. A pause. "All these years," Broker answered quietly. "Yes." "And you protected it." Another silence. Adrian finally understood the final structure beneath Broker's philosophy. He had never truly wanted to destroy the system. He inherited it, maintained it, expanded it, because deep down, he still believed the city above would collapse without hidden control. Broker hated the hierarchy, but he also feared life without it. That contradiction explained everything. Thomas stared at the survivors in horror. "How many of you are there?" the elderly woman answered calmly. "Not many anymore." Her voice echoed softly through the underground city. "Time kills slower underground." A pause. "But it still kills." Another figure stepped into the light, then another. Old men, women, a few younger faces too, children born beneath Manhattan, generations hidden below the city. Impossible, and yet completely real. Harris looked devastated. "The government knew," the woman almost smiled. "Governments always know." The underground station lights flickered weaker. Citadel was losing power gradually now. Without Manhattan above, the hidden systems below were dying too. Broker finally stepped toward the survivors. "You shouldn't have come up." The woman looked at him sadly. "You brought them here." Adrian watched carefully now. Patterns again, always patterns. Broker built his ideology around abandonment, but these people did not look abandoned anymore. They looked tired, human, alive, not symbols. That destroyed the mythology completely. Rachel stepped slowly away from Broker's network, toward the survivors. One of the operators followed her, then another. Small movements, small choices, the structure fracturing further. Broker noticed everything, of course he did. But for the first time, he could not control the direction of the movement anymore. The city above had escaped hierarchy. Now Citadel below was escaping it too. Adrian spoke quietly. "You wanted people to see the truth." Broker looked toward him. "Yes, they already have." A pause, but not the truth you expected. Silence again. Then suddenly, all emergency radios across Citadel activated simultaneously. Live police frequencies flooded the underground station. Power restoration beginning in Midtown. Civilian volunteers assisting evacuation. Subway workers reopening blocked tunnels manually. Harris stared at the radios. They're restoring the city. Not perfectly, not cleanly, but collectively. Human beings improvising again, helping, adapting, surviving without centralized structure. Exactly what Broker believed impossible long term. The giant Manhattan map flickered weakly back to life, section by section. Power returning gradually across the city, not ordered, chaotic, but alive. The elderly woman looked toward the map silently, then whispered, "They survived." Broker's expression changed slightly, something breaking internally, not rage, not madness, something worse, disappointment. Because if humanity could survive without becoming purely hierarchical, then the suffering beneath Manhattan lost its philosophical certainty. And certainty was the foundation of Broker's entire identity. Adrian stepped closer. "You weren't preserving memory." Broker looked at him slowly. "You were preserving justification." That one sentence hit harder than any weapon in the room. The survivors behind the blast doors remained silent, watching, waiting. And for the first time, Broker had no answer ready. The underground city trembled again, much harder now. Concrete cracked loudly above them. Citadel was collapsing structurally. The blackout damaged more than Manhattan. It damaged the hidden foundations beneath it too. Harris looked upward sharply. "We need to move." One of the engineers shouted from the control station, "Lower support systems are failing." Dust exploded from the ceiling. Sirens returned across the underground city. This time, real ones. Structural collapse warnings. The survivors began retreating deeper into the tunnels calmly, used to catastrophe, used to survival. The elderly woman looked at Broker one final time. "You built your whole life around the night they locked us below." Broker said nothing. Then she added softly, "But they failed." Silence. Another crack split through Citadel's ceiling overhead. Adrian watched Broker carefully, and for the first time, the man looked completely lost. Because the city above was surviving imperfectly, and the people below were surviving despite abandonment. Both realities destroyed the philosophy he built his life upon. The underground alarm screamed louder, emergency lights turning deep red now. Citadel was dying, and somewhere above them, Manhattan was beginning to wake back up. Citadel was collapsing. Concrete dust poured through the underground city like grey snow. Emergency sirens echoed endlessly through steel corridors beneath Manhattan, and somewhere above them, New York was slowly returning to life. Lights flickered back across Midtown, police radios stabilized, transit systems restarted one line at a time. The city had not survived cleanly, but it had survived. That was the problem. Broker stood motionless beneath the failing emergency lights, watching the giant Manhattan map restore itself section by section, not perfect order, human order, improvised, messy, alive. Adrian approached him carefully. "You underestimated uncertainty." Broker's eyes never left the glowing city grid. "No." A pause. "I underestimated memory." Interesting answer. Very interesting. Because now, Broker finally sounded tired. Not ideological, not theatrical, human. The underground station trembled violently again. A steel beam collapsed somewhere above the archive corridors. Thomas Reed flinched. "We need to leave now." Harris nodded immediately. "He's right. This whole place is coming down." The survivors from the lower tunnels had already vanished back into darkness, silent, disciplined, like people who learned decades ago never to trust structures above them. Rachel stepped beside Adrian slowly. "What happens to them now?" Adrian looked toward the black tunnels beneath Citadel. "The same thing that happens to every buried truth." A pause. "Someone decides whether it's useful." Broker finally turned toward them, and for the first time, the certainty was gone from his eyes completely. Only exhaustion remained. "They won't let the city remember," Harris answered coldly. "After tonight, they won't have a choice." Broker almost smiled at that. "You still think governments lose control because people discover truth?" The underground lights flickered again. "No." He looked toward the collapsing archive. "They lose control because truth multiplies." Adrian studied him carefully. The philosophy was breaking apart now, but the intelligence remained. That made Broker even more dangerous, because intelligent men without certainty become unpredictable. Then, suddenly, one of the surviving operators rushed toward Broker from the communications station, panicked. "Elias!" Everyone noticed the name now. Not Broker. Elias, human identity replacing myth again. The operator handed him a small printed transmission sheet. Broker read it silently, and Adrian immediately saw the change. Real alarm, not calculated. "What is it?" Rachel asked quietly. Broker looked toward the dead emergency monitors, then finally answered. "Somebody activated the secondary cipher." Silence. Thomas frowned. "What does that mean?" Adrian's expression darkened instantly. Interesting, very interesting, because nothing in Broker's operation suggested backup leadership structures, unless, then, he understood. The ledger wasn't the only archive. Broker looked toward him slowly. No. The underground city shook harder again. Concrete cracked above the observation chambers. Emergency lights dimmed blood red. Harris grabbed the transmission from Broker's hand roughly. "What secondary cipher?" Broker answered quietly. "The original network." Adrian took the paper from Harris carefully. A series of coded coordinates, transit lines, communication nodes, government buildings, and beside them, one repeated phrase. "Glass protocol active." Thomas whispered, "Oh God." Adrian stared at the transmission silently, then finally understood the deeper structure beneath everything. Broker was never the head of the system. He was one survivor, shaped by it. But systems this large never depend on one man. The real architecture remained hidden elsewhere. Broker spoke quietly now. "Citadel was only containment." Harris looked furious. "You're telling me there's more?" "Yes." Another tremor shook the underground station violently. A section of ceiling collapsed near the preserved classroom. Dust exploded through the air. Children's drawings vanished beneath rubble, the hidden history of Manhattan burying itself again. Rachel looked toward Broker. "You knew this could happen." "No." He finally sounded honest. "I knew they would react. Huge difference. Adrian folded the transmission slowly. Glass protocol. Broker nodded once. The contingency system. For what? Broker looked toward the giant Manhattan map. For exposure. The answer chilled the room, because it meant tonight's events were never supposed to end with Citadel. This was escalation. Designed escalation. Then one of the underground monitors suddenly flickered weakly back online. Static rolled across the screen. Then an image appeared. A government office somewhere above Manhattan. Empty. Dark. Except for one thing. The windows. Every window shattered outward simultaneously. Thomas stepped backward. What the hell? Another camera feed activated. Then another. Across Manhattan. Glass was exploding. Office towers, transit stations, government buildings, not bombs, pressure waves. The city itself reacting to infrastructure instability underground. Broker whispered quietly, "No." Interesting, very interesting, because he genuinely had not expected this. Adrian stared at the screens carefully. Patterns. Always patterns. The pressure failures followed exact structural routes beneath Manhattan. Old Cold War support tunnels, emergency reinforcement corridors. Someone activated the hidden systems incorrectly, or intentionally. Then the underground radios exploded with new emergency frequencies. Multiple structural failures across Midtown. Glass collapse near Lexington. Subway tunnel breach beneath Grand Central. The city above was becoming physically unstable now. Not socially. Architecturally. Thomas looked horrified. The whole city's fallen apart. No, Adrian said quietly. The hidden parts are. Huge difference. The visible New York still stood, but the buried infrastructure beneath it, the secret systems, were collapsing violently, like the city was rejecting the architecture hidden below it for decades. Broker stared at the broken monitors silently, then finally said something Adrian never expected to hear. "I was trying to stop this." Silence crushed the room. Harris almost laughed angrily. "Are you insane?" "No." Adrian answered before Broker could. "He means the system beneath Manhattan was already unstable." "Correct. Broker's operation exposed it, destabilized it. But something older had now activated independently. The original network. The people who built Citadel, the people who buried the survivors, the actual architects." Rachel looked terrified now. "You said the network ended after 1958? Broker's eyes remained fixed on the screens. "I was wrong." That terrified Adrian more than anything else tonight, because if Broker had spent his entire life investigating the buried system, and still misunderstood its size, then Manhattan was sitting on something far older and more dangerous than revenge. Another underground explosion echoed somewhere beneath Citadel. The station lights died briefly again, then returned weaker. The entire underground city was failing rapidly now. Harris grabbed Adrian's arm. "We move now." Adrian nodded slowly. "Yes." But before anyone could leave, every surviving monitor inside Citadel activated simultaneously. One image appeared across all screens. A symbol. A circle divided by a vertical line. The same mark from the Black Ledger. Then words appeared beneath it. "The Parliament remembers." Broker went completely pale, and for the first time since this began, Adrian realized there was something underground even Broker feared. The words remained glowing across every screen inside Citadel. "The Parliament remembers." No one spoke, because fear changes shape when intelligent people become afraid. And Broker, Elias, looked terrified. Not shocked, not confused, terrified. Adrian watched him carefully. Tiny changes again, faster breathing, rigid posture, eyes fixed too long on the symbol. Recognition, deep recognition. Thomas whispered, "What is the Parliament?" Broker did not answer immediately. The underground city trembled violently again. More glass shattered somewhere inside Citadel. The hidden world beneath Manhattan was collapsing around them now. Finally, Broker spoke quietly. "The first architects." Silence. Harris frowned. "Architects of what?" Broker looked toward the dying Manhattan map. "Modern emergency governance." Another tremor rolled through the underground station. Dust poured from ceiling cracks. The emergency lights dimmed weaker. Adrian stepped closer. "You thought you exposed the system?" Broker almost laughed bitterly. "I thought I inherited it." Huge difference, and suddenly everything became clearer. Broker was never the creator of the Black Ledger. He was a product of it. A survivor shaped into a weapon by a structure much older than himself. Rachel looked horrified. "You mean somebody controlled Citadel before you?" "Yes." Broker's voice sounded distant now, and they never truly disappeared. The screens flickered. Then old black and white footage appeared automatically. Government officials entering underground tunnels beneath Manhattan, military escorts, civil defense directors, bankers, judges, power moving below the city during crisis rehearsals. Then Adrian noticed the symbol again. Not hidden. Visible openly on official documents, the divided circle. Not Broker's mark, their mark, the Parliament. Broker stared at the footage silently. They believed civilization could only survive through controlled hierarchy. Thomas whispered, "Selection?" Broker nodded slowly. "Yes." The footage changed again. Emergency simulations, population sorting models, civilian sacrifice projections, entire neighborhoods marked expendable during hypothetical crises, cold mathematics disguised as policy. Adrian understood now. The Parliament was not a secret society. It was worse. An institutional philosophy hidden inside government infrastructure, a belief system, and beliefs survive longer than organizations. Then another image appeared. Young Elias standing underground beside Judge Malcolm Wren, not as prisoner. "Observer?" Thomas looked confused. "You worked with them?" Broker's expression darkened. "No." A pause. "They studied me." Silence again. Rachel stepped backward slowly. "What does that mean?" Broker looked toward the preserved classroom buried behind broken glass. They wanted to understand what abandonment creates. The underground station suddenly felt much colder, because Adrian finally understood the truth. The survivors beneath Manhattan were never merely hidden. They were observed, studied, like psychological experiments beneath the city. The footage changed again. Medical evaluations, behavior reports, emergency adaptation studies, children growing underground after the evacuation disaster. Broker, among them, watched constantly, recorded constantly. Thomas whispered in horror, "They turned you into this?" "No." Broker's voice sharpened slightly. "The city did." Adrian interrupted quietly. "No." Everyone looked toward him. "You still refuse to separate systems from people." Broker stared at him silently. Adrian continued, "The Parliament built the structure." A pause. "But you chose what to become inside it." That hit harder than accusation, because deep down, Broker already knew it was true. The underground alarm screamed louder suddenly. One of the blast doors collapsed partially inward, steel twisting violently. Citadel was dying quickly now. Harris grabbed a flashlight from the emergency cabinet. "We're running out of time." Then every screen inside the underground city changed again, simultaneously. Live footage, Manhattan above. The blackout was ending. But now the city looked different. Thousands of civilians filled the streets, helping direct traffic manually. Subway workers guiding people through tunnels with flashlights, restaurants distributing food freely, hospitals running emergency care, outside building entrances. Not order, human improvisation. The exact thing Broker believed unsustainable. Rachel stared at the screens quietly. They're helping each other. Broker watched silently, then whispered, "For now." Adrian shook his head slowly. "You still don't understand." The underground city trembled again. People don't survive because systems function perfectly. A pause. They survive because imperfect people adapt together. Silence followed. The network members remaining beside Broker looked uncertain now, lost, their ideology fracturing visibly because reality above Manhattan no longer matched the philosophy below it. Then one of the surviving operators shouted from the communications desk, "We intercepted something." Everyone turned instantly. The operator looked pale. "It's coming from the old government channels." Static flooded the speakers. Then a new voice emerged, older, cold, perfectly controlled, not Broker. "Citadel containment has failed." Every remaining network member froze. The voice continued. "Glass protocol entering final stage." Broker whispered quietly, "No." Adrian noticed genuine fear again. Interesting, very interesting, because Elias knew this voice personally. The transmission continued. "Recovery teams are now authorized." Harris frowned. "Recovery teams," Broker finally answered quietly. "The Parliament never planned to preserve the city." Silence. Then, "They planned to preserve themselves after it collapsed." Cold realization spread through Citadel. The evacuation systems, the hierarchy, the underground shelters, none of it existed to save civilization. Only leadership, continuity. Exactly as Adrian suspected from the beginning. The voice on the transmission continued calmly. "Surviving witnesses are to be reclaimed." Rachel looked horrified. "Reclaimed?" Broker's eyes darkened. "The survivors below Manhattan," Thomas whispered. "They're coming for them." "Yes." Another tremor shook the underground station violently. Then, far above them, came a new sound. Helicopters, many of them. The surviving monitors flickered toward the Manhattan skyline. Black military helicopters moving through the darkness over Midtown. No official markings, no visible insignia, just the divided circle symbol painted beneath the aircraft. The Parliament, not hidden anymore, active, real, and descending toward Manhattan openly for the first time in decades. Adrian stared at the screen silently, then finally understood. Tonight was never about revenge, never about panic, never even about Citadel. Broker had accidentally awakened the original machine buried beneath the city, and now the people who built the hidden architecture of Manhattan had returned to reclaim it. The helicopters circled above Manhattan like black insects, silent at first, then louder. Their rotor blades echoed between skyscrapers across the dark city. The divided circle symbol glowed faintly beneath each aircraft. The Parliament was no longer hidden. Not completely. Not tonight. Inside Citadel, the remaining monitors flickered weakly beneath failing power. Live footage showed unmarked vehicles flooding Midtown streets, men in dark coats moving through blackout zones. Disciplined, efficient, no police insignia, no military identification, just the symbol. Thomas Reed stared at the screens in disbelief. they're taking over the city? No, Adrian said quietly. They're reclaiming infrastructure. Huge difference. The Parliament did not think like governments. Governments protect appearances. The Parliament protected continuity, and continuity required control beneath public visibility. Broker stood motionless near the dead operations table, watching the helicopters silently. For the first time since Adrian met him, Elias looked old, not physically, structurally, like a man realizing his rebellion never escaped the system that created him. Rachel stepped closer, carefully. You said they disappeared after the evacuation years, Broker answered softly. I believed they did. Another tremor shook Citadel violently. A support beam collapsed across the upper archive balcony. Dust exploded through the underground chamber. Emergency lights flickered dangerously. The city below Manhattan was dying, but the Parliament above Manhattan was arriving. Adrian studied Broker carefully. Interesting, very interesting. Because now Elias faced the same realization Adrian understood hours ago. Systems survive individuals, even revolutionaries. Then the underground communication desk crackled again. One of the operators shouted nervously, "They're broadcasting citywide now." Static rolled through the speakers. Then the cold voice returned. The same older voice from earlier, perfectly controlled. Citizens of New York. Every monitor across Citadel activated simultaneously. The Parliament symbol filled every screen. Temporary emergency authority has been enacted under continuity provisions. Harris cursed quietly. They're declaring martial control. No, Adrian corrected. They're declaring invisible control visible. The voice continued calmly. Civilian cooperation will ensure restoration of public stability. Live footage flooded the screens. Parliament recovery teams entering subway systems, securing underground access points, blocking tunnels, moving with terrifying preparation. This had not been organized tonight. This was decades old. The voice continued. All unauthorized individuals within restricted infrastructure zones will be detained. Thomas looked toward Broker slowly. They mean us. Broker nodded once. Yes. Another pause. And the survivors. The lower blast doors beyond Citadel suddenly slammed shut automatically. Heavy steel sealing the underground routes. The survivors beneath Manhattan were being trapped again, exactly like 1958. Rachel whispered, "No." Adrian moved toward the control panels immediately. Most systems dead, power unstable. But one emergency route still flickered weakly on the map. A maintenance line beneath lower Manhattan. Interesting. Very interesting. The Parliament was securing major corridors first, meaning smaller routes remained vulnerable temporarily. Adrian turned toward Broker. How many access routes still exist below Citadel? Elias stared at him silently for a second, then finally answered, 3. Which one they least expect? Broker's eyes narrowed slightly. Recognition. The old strategic instinct returning. East Maintenance descent. Harris frowned. You planning to run? No, Adrian said quietly. We're planning to move before the system closes. Huge difference. The underground city trembled harder. Concrete cracked across the observation windows. One entire wall of preserved files collapsed into darkness. The hidden history of Manhattan literally burying itself again. Then suddenly, the lower tunnel speakers activated, but this time, not with the Parliament voice. Children laughing again, soft, echoing through the deep underground corridors, the survivors still moving below the city, still alive. Broker looked toward the sealed blast doors slowly, and Adrian finally saw the truth clearly. Elias never wanted the survivors erased. Everything he built, the ledger, the panic, the exposure, was ultimately designed to stop the Parliament from reclaiming the underground system permanently. He wasn't trying to destroy the city. He was trying to force it to see what lived beneath it before the Parliament buried it forever again. Adrian spoke quietly. You knew they would come back eventually. Broker answered just as softly, yes. Rachel looked toward him in disbelief. Then why start this now? Elias stared at the dark Manhattan screens because they were preparing another selection. Silence consumed Citadel. Adrian's expression darkened instantly. Interesting. Very interesting, because that changed everything. Not historical preservation, future preparation. Broker continued quietly. The energy crisis. A pause. The transit restructuring. His eyes moved toward the hidden emergency routes beneath Manhattan. They were rebuilding the evacuation architecture. Harris whispered, "Oh my God." The Parliament never abandoned the philosophy. They modernized it, and tonight's blackout accelerated their activation schedule. The communication speakers crackled again. Recovery teams entering lower Manhattan sectors. Then gunfire echoed faintly through one of the live subway feeds. Not chaos, controlled suppression. The Parliament was already sealing civilians out of underground routes, history repeating itself in real time. Thomas looked horrified. They're doing it again? Yes, Adrian said quietly, and this time they learned from 1958. No witnesses left below, no survivors, no evidence. Citadel suddenly shook with a massive impact. One of the upper tunnels collapsed completely. Darkness swallowed half the underground station. Emergency lights failed section by section. The city beneath Manhattan was dying fast now. Broker looked toward Adrian, and, for the first time, there was no ideology left between them. Only urgency. You know what happens next. Adrian nodded slowly. Yes. The Parliament would seal the underground system permanently, bury the survivors, restore the city above, and rewrite the narrative before morning, exactly as they always had. Unless... Adrian looked toward the surviving monitors, toward Manhattan, toward the civilians already helping one another above ground, improvising, communicating, refusing hierarchy naturally. Then he finally understood the only move left. Not exposure. Broadcast. He looked back at Broker. We don't stop them underground. Elias stared at him, then slowly realized what Adrian meant. The city itself had to see the truth live before the Parliament restored control, and somewhere above Manhattan, the power was beginning to return. Citadel groaned beneath Manhattan like a dying machine. Steel screamed somewhere deep below the lower tunnels. Concrete split across the archive walls. Emergency lights flickered in violent pulses of red and white. And above them, New York was waking back up, section by section, street by street. Power returning unevenly across the skyline. Adrian stood beside the surviving operations console, thinking. Patterns, broadcast systems, transit relays, emergency communication architecture. The Parliament controlled infrastructure, but infrastructure always has one weakness. It was designed to reach everyone. Broker stepped beside him quietly. You're thinking about the citywide emergency network. Adrian nodded once. Yes. Rachel looked confused. What network? Broker answered before Adrian could. "The old Civil Defense Broadcast System." A pause. "Originally designed for nuclear evacuation alerts," Thomas frowned. "That still exists?" Adrian looked toward the dying monitors. "Systems built for catastrophe are rarely dismantled. They're hidden, repurposed, forgotten, but never removed completely." Harris checked the remaining routes on the underground map. "You planning to hijack emergency broadcasts?" "No," Adrian said quietly. "We're planning to force visibility." Huge difference. Visibility destroys controlled narratives, and controlled narratives were the Parliament's true weapon. The underground radios crackled again. Recovery teams now entering Citadel perimeter sectors. They were close, very close. The Parliament would reach the underground city soon, and once they secured the archives, history would disappear again. Broker stared silently toward the lower tunnels where the survivors had vanished. "They'll seal every corridor." "Yes," Adrian replied, "which means we stop trying to preserve the underground." Rachel looked toward him. "Then what do we preserve?" Adrian's eyes moved toward Manhattan glowing weakly above the monitors. Memory. That was the real war now. Not territory, not tunnels, narrative. The Parliament survived because people never saw the architecture beneath civilization. Once visible, systems become vulnerable. Another violent tremor hit Citadel. The giant Manhattan map shattered across the center. Glass exploded across the underground floor. Thomas jumped backward. "We're out of time." "No," Adrian said quietly. "We're finally synchronized with it." Interesting, very interesting, because now the chaos above and below Manhattan had merged into the same event. The hidden city was surfacing, literally. Then one of the surviving operators shouted from the communications desk, "I found an active relay line." Everyone turned instantly. The operator looked terrified. "It connects directly into the emergency television and radio grid." Broker moved immediately. "How long?" "Minutes maybe before they trace us." "Enough." Adrian approached the console quickly. Old analog equipment flickered weakly beneath emergency power. Civil defense systems from another era, built to speak to millions during catastrophe. Exactly what they needed. Thomas stared nervously. "You're seriously going to tell New York all this?" "No." Adrian adjusted the transmission frequencies carefully. "We're going to show them." Huge difference. People ignore explanations. Images survive. Broker understood that immediately. His expression shifted slightly. First real agreement between them all night. Rachel looked toward the underground archives. "The survivors," Broker answered quietly. "They decide for themselves now." Another change. No more systems, no more selection. Choice. Human choice. The thing he spent his life believing civilization eventually destroys. The underground lights dimmed dangerously again. Citadel was close to catastrophic structural failure now. The Parliament recovery teams would arrive soon, and suddenly gunfire echoed faintly through the upper tunnels, closer than before. Harris drew his revolver instantly. "They're here." The communications operator panicked. "We lost half the signal lines." Adrian looked toward Broker. "How much access do you still have underground?" Elias stared at the collapsing city around them, then quietly answered, "Enough." That single word changed the room. Because for the first time, Broker stopped thinking like a philosopher and started thinking like a survivor again. The old emergency monitors flickered back to life suddenly. Live feeds from Manhattan streets filled the screens. Crowds gathered around battery-powered radios, police officers directing civilians manually, subway workers leading trapped passengers above ground, human improvisation everywhere, messy, unstable, alive. Adrian looked at the images silently, then finally said, "That's the real city." Broker watched the screens too, no answer this time, because deep down, he knew Adrian was right. Civilization was not the architecture beneath Manhattan, it was the imperfect people above it adapting together constantly. The Parliament mistook control for survival, Broker mistook exposure for truth. Both misunderstood something essential. Human beings are unpredictable collectively, and unpredictability is why systems never remain absolute forever. The underground station suddenly shook with another massive impact, this one different, explosive. Dust blasted through the tunnels. The blast doors above Citadel bent inward violently. The Parliament had breached the upper sectors. The operators shouted over each other, "They're entering the archive." "We lost North Corridors. Signal degradation critical." Harris looked toward Adrian. "Now or never." Adrian nodded once, then activated the emergency broadcast channel. Static flooded every speaker inside Citadel. The old civil defense transmission system awakened beneath Manhattan for the first time in decades. A red light illuminated across the console. Live transmission active. Broker stared at the glowing signal silently, then quietly asked, "What do we tell them?" Adrian looked toward the shattered underground city around them. The hidden classrooms, the preserved belongings, the collapsing archive of buried people, then toward the screens showing New Yorkers helping each other survive above ground. Finally, he answered, "The truth." The speakers hummed louder. Emergency frequencies connected across Manhattan. Radio stations interrupted. Television screens flickered. Car radios hissed with static. Millions of people listening without understanding why. And somewhere in the upper tunnels, the Parliament recovery teams were descending toward Citadel. Adrian leaned toward the microphone slowly, but before he could speak, another voice cut across the transmission first, cold, controlled, familiar. "The Parliament. You are listening to unauthorized psychological destabilization material." Every screen across Citadel flashed the divided circle symbol again. The voice continued calmly. "Remain indoors. Avoid all unverified emergency narratives." Broker almost smiled bitterly. "There it is." Adrian looked toward him. The real language of power. Not violence, not guns, narrative control. The Parliament wasn't trying to stop panic, they were trying to preserve certainty. Then the underground speakers crackled again, and suddenly the survivors below Manhattan began singing softly through the lower tunnels. Old voices, broken voices, children's voices mixed among them, a song carried upward from beneath the city. The same song trapped civilians once sang underground during the 1958 blackout shelters. The sound echoed through Citadel like memory itself, refusing burial. And above Manhattan, millions of radios carried it live into the city for the first time in decades. End of episode 3.